My goal here is really to showcase, I think, some of the most inspiring voices in the job tech sector so that we, embark on the day with shared enthusiasm and shared understanding for what job tech means, what the potential is here on the continent, and set us up for the kinds of questions we want to explore for the rest of the day. So maybe I can start with our sort of ecosystem players, the knowledge builders in the middle of the panel, to share with us what is exciting, what makes you really believe that there's potential here, and maybe give us some examples.
I think what I'm excited about, and I think it's it's a pressing need right now, is kind of job tech platforms going global, right? And what I mean is effectively targeting demand overseas, right? I think I sit in Nigeria, and over the last 2 years, you've seen the naira, the Nigerian currency, kind of deteriorate, right? And so that really puts the impetus on startups, founders in Nigeria to think beyond kind of earning in local currency, right? Because especially if you take, if you raise any funding that's USD denominated, for example. So there's a big drive for startups to really think about, how do I connect basically talent, demand, supply on the ground, on the continent to demand overseas, right? So in terms of concrete examples, and the other thing exciting, if you want to talk about that, is to overlay that kind of broad theme with kind of newer themes of AI, right? So you think about, okay, how can we as Africans tap into this kind of AI movement? And there's the whole examples of kind of the early stages of AI are data labeling, right? So to teach for a computer to say, okay, this is a cat, this is not a cat. Someone has to train that, right? There has to be a human in the loop. And there's opportunities for Africans to be that human in the loop. You see an example with Sama out of Kenya. There's also interesting examples. I can't think of some other ones right now, not relative to AI, but relative to kind of serving the world. I think in terms of selling, there's a company called Africa Anka out of Ivory Coast. There's a few other companies that are, in the early phase of doing this. But that's kind of what's exciting to me. So thinking, how do we use Africans as kind of, you heard the term breadbasket, but the labor basket, to say, okay, we have a pool of labor here that's relatively low cost on a global scale to now also serve global demand.
From my perspective, I think it's interesting, this question about, is tech going to solve everything? I think that's a little bit of a misnomer and not necessarily even the right conversation to be having. I look at it from a perspective of there's this huge problem that needs to be addressed. Tech is a tool to address it, but really we should be talking about all of the above, right? And so I don't think that job tech is going to create all of the jobs, but it's better than nothing, right? Certainly there is a wide opportunity for impact here. And I'm quite excited, at least, about the evolution of the conversations that we're having about what success looks like, right? So I think if you saw that video, we had a bit of a provocative conclusion to the intro, which was saying that maybe we shouldn't be talking about formal jobs, for example, but about what a portfolio of work looks like. And so I think about it through that lens. Actually, it's not necessarily that any one type of opportunity or sector is particularly interesting, but if we over time learn better about what works in the context of what these markets look like today, does that leave the proverbial we better equipped to solve problems and to make a dent in this issue? And I think that that's true.
And I guess when you think about tech, I think most people think like high tech, but I think there are also opportunities for low tech as well, right? We've seen a couple of years back, no one had WhatsApp. Right now, tons and tons of people actually have, millions of people have WhatsApp. And we're starting to see job tech platforms within the continent leveraging some of already existing technology. Like one platform in Ethiopia that actually is doing matching people to jobs. But instead of using fancy high-tech things, but they're actually using Telegram and enabling hundreds and thousands of people to actually get jobs. Because one of the things we're seeing is what platforms are doing, especially in countries that are just starting to be more developed, is giving opportunities to information. So, like I guess in Ethiopia, like right now, people like, where do I get a job? This platform is actually able to solve that by showing like, here's an opportunity you're able to do, but you don't need to have high tech. You can have Telegram on your phone and be able to do that. So we are seeing more opportunities of how people are using tech to enable either access to information or increase efficiency at the platform level.
Yeah, that's awesome. I agree with everything. Imran and Brian, I want to turn the next question to you. And my question is, I think the other kind of skeptic in the room tends to say these things are not scalable, right? Like maybe you can create 50 jobs, you can match a handful of people, but both of your firms are scaled and scalable and have really proven that we can create job opportunities, right? Some kind of income earning opportunity in massive numbers. So my question for you is, what does it really take to scale a business in Africa? And for all of our founders out here, what should they really be thinking about? What are the levers from the startup space?
So I'll just piggyback off of what Justin just mentioned. I think fundamentally technology is an accelerant, or it like eases processes, right? But what's the underlying process that's there? And I think in terms of jobs as it is right now, and the video, I'll go back to the video again, it really mentions that there is a segment of employment that's happening in Africa that's not largely tapped or formalized, right? So from that perspective, that's the role that I see technology playing. Like, how do you formalize this sector? How do you create more opportunities and so on and so forth, right? In terms of scaling a business, it will always come down to one thing: what problem are you trying to solve, and how are you trying to solve it, and do you constantly adapt, innovate as that problem, as you keep doing it. I think Chris mentioned earlier something to do with a blue-collar platform, for lack of a better description, and maybe the time he did it was not the right time, but these are things that need to be formalized, right? In terms of the actual business aspect of it, it's people. Really, fundamentally, it's people at all times. And the rest of that sort of builds up from the people themselves, right? So the other things, and all these acronyms I want to mention: operational efficiency, innovation, dealing with your margins, and just making sure that all this critical information you need to solve a business is on hand. And not just it being on hand, like, are you actually acting on the information you're receiving to be able to adapt, move, change quickly enough to deal with the changes in the market? But I'll say it again, fundamentally, what problem are you trying to solve? Are you solving it effectively? Are you innovating fast enough?
Sure, so from our perspective, everything we do has to be at scale. The scale that we operate at is enormous, so anything that is manual just can't work. So if you look at a concrete example, the electrification of mobility. Electric bikes are a huge opportunity in this part of the world, but there's a chicken and egg situation. Nobody's going to buy an electric bike and then they have 3 places around the city to charge. Similarly, nobody's going to deploy charging infrastructure when there's only 3 bikes on the road. So that's where we feel that we can come in. So for example, last year we launched an electric bike product. And what we were able to do is we were able to commit significant scale in the hundreds of bikes into this segment, which then led the charging infrastructure partners to have enough confidence to deploy the charging tech, which then gives the end user the confidence to purchase the bike because they know that there's now 60, 70 charging stations around the city. So I'd say the way we looked at this is that we found a problem that we wanted to solve, and we thought about what's really the blocker to this becoming the ubiquitous way of getting around the city. And then where can we help with the scale that we already have, which was that large-scale commitment that, look, we will back this fully. You have that sort of back-end demand generation through the Uber platform, and then hopefully the whole industry takes that leap forward together.
I'm thinking about like the demand and supply challenges, right? For any JobTech platform, you can't just think about one side. You have to think about, do I have the demand? I think that actually enables that scale. But also on the supply side, like, do you actually have people to grow? And I think for like Uber case, like, how do you ensure you actually have enough drivers to be on the ground so that if somebody asks you for an Uber, you ask for an Uber, there is a driver. But what's the right number to be able to actually maintain that? I think for me, I still have that question. It's like, where do you actually plan in terms of like demand and supply?
It's a really good question, and it goes to the fundamental of a lot of these intermediary platforms, where if there's no demand, then there's no supply, and vice versa. So at Uber, our perspective is always to see if we can get the supply on board first, and then we start growing the demand. And that would involve things like either borrowing supply from another category. So for example, if we want to launch Uber Comfort, we'll borrow supply from UberX, which then enables people to start using Comfort. They like it. Drivers now see this product has good earnings. They then start migrating their vehicles to become Uber Comfort vehicles. Or we use things like what we did on the electric bike, which is a fleet. So we'll say, look, individual investor, you come in, you commit to X hundred vehicles, you got the Uber sort of backing for it, and that is the kickstart that gets the flywheel going. Yeah. Otherwise, it can be extremely slow and difficult to do.
And on this supply and demand question, I think what the Jobtech Alliance does that's quite interesting is distinguish like local jobs versus global jobs, right? So to Emeka's point about people in Nigeria wanting to use Jobtech platforms to find overseas jobs, I think in that context it's especially because people want dollars and not naira. But there's also this notion that the local economies, there is a fundamental demand constraint, right? So maybe not necessarily for Uber, but for a lot of platforms, I think, maybe you run into a hard edge. And in the context of the tech ecosystem, we talk a lot about multi-market expansion, but I don't think it's an either or thing, but certainly, globally, if there's markets to tap into where the demand is wider, then platforms are going to find success where they can connect, talent and labor to global opportunities as well.
Yeah, I feel like we're starting to get at a lesson here, right? That first you need to have the supply. You have to be ready to meet whatever demand you create or you've identified. And this is something that we talk about a lot with portfolio companies, that you've sold a business and you've sold some kind of promise, some kind of value, and if you're not able to deliver, you've now lost this potential customer forever. It's very difficult to sort of repair that trust. I wonder, Chris mentioned this earlier today, that we shouldn't be making the same mistakes over and over again. So I wonder, for everybody on the panel, where do you think platforms making those same mistakes? What are the same mistakes that we're seeing over and over again that we should really stop making, that we should take as lessons so that we can actually move forward?
No, so I'll answer that question and go back to kind of the previous question you asked. I think because I was thinking, you talk about the Uber example, the Jobberman, I'm thinking Nigeria, Brighter Monday, etc., in terms of scaled job platforms in Africa. And I was thinking to myself, outside of some of these big brands, like what are some other scaled job tech platforms? And the one that comes to mind is really telco agent networks, right? So if you think about the agent as a micro entrepreneur who's basically serving that demand of people who want to send and receive money, and they're the ones getting a cut of that, supplying that service effectively. So to tie into your current question, I think there's a lot of possibility to study how that model became successful, right? So obviously I think a lot of people look to M-Pesa, but it's beyond M-Pesa now. There's I think maybe even MTN in Ghana is a stronger example. So just to think about that model, how do I reach the end user, facilitate additional income for them in a structured manner, right? I think part of what helps Uber be successful in Africa is the structure and the processes are repeatable and scalable. And that's something that's a lot of platforms, job tech platforms, don't have yet in place. And to more directly answer your question in terms of what I see in terms of repeated problems, it's actually what Chris mentioned, right? I said in Nigeria, for the last 10 years, people have been trying to create an Uber for artisans, right? So not just in Nigeria, like almost every market. Everywhere, it seems like such an easy idea, right? Uber worked for motorcycles, Uber's worked for cars. Why not this other thing? People need artisans, right? People are using artisans, so obviously there's a market here. But for whatever reason, that just hasn't worked, and I think there hasn't been a concerted effort to identify why. I think Chris is one of the few that's written about his experience, and Chris is one of the few that's written about his experience with actually building Link. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well for all the different people throughout the years that have built these platforms to come and share their learnings and put something together systematically.
Imran, you want something to add? Let's do Imran and then Brian.
Sure. So from my perspective, I definitely echo what Emeka said. One of the biggest misconceptions that we see is that people fundamentally underestimate how expensive it is to run a platform. When you look at a service provider and you look at a consumer and you're saying, well, I'm making a small margin on that. That sounds fantastic, but the costs involved, you see so many companies. If you take eBay, if you take Airbnb, why is it that the commissions are higher than you'd perhaps expect? And it's the same with ride hailing. You have, every few months you have a startup coming in saying, look, this is so simple, I can do it. But they really underestimate the costs that are involved. When you discussed supply earlier on, when we go into a new city and we can't rely on a fleet partner or we can't rely on existing supply, we often pay drivers to be online so that when a customer wants a ride from Shamba, that there's one next door. The amount of cash involved is enormous. And then promotions, incentives, the tech underpinning it. So for me, the biggest mistake is underestimating the costs to run a marketplace.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with both of you, really. I think what I would say is fundamentally, even from an idea perspective, if you don't have the processes and the systems to be able to scale something and the resources at a massive scale, then it becomes difficult, right? Like in our case, for example, we're part of a much larger conglomerate that's out of Switzerland and operate quite a number of Jobtech platforms across Europe, right? So we can very easily replicate that here and be patient enough with the kind of resources needed. The larger issue, I think, for me, in terms of mistakes, would be around the business model, and that applies across the board in the sense that we often want to do replication, right? You want to replicate what's happening in Europe and take copy-paste and put it in Africa, but the dynamics and everything is completely different, right? So for jobs in particular, back to the supply and demand topic, so let me just give you a snippet into the job market here, right? On average, I think in Kenya, for each job we put out, we get maybe 150 applications, right? So the supply is crazy. And in Europe, it's the complete opposite, right? If you go to a country like Switzerland, you're getting 1-2 applications for a role, right? So inherently, if you have a business model that's focusing on job advertising or on promotion of jobs, based on what you're seeing in Europe and bringing it here, it's just not going to make any money, right? And then on the demand side, you have to go through employer education. Similar to what Imran was mentioning, you have to go through employer education, you have to go through all these different things because you're changing a mindset to build a business above, right? So again, back to what I mentioned earlier, if you're not adaptable to these different nuances within the market, in Africa in particular, there is nothing you're going to do fully online and make money. It's almost impossible. You have to have a blend of an offline strategy and an online strategy for you to move forward. And if you don't have the resources or the processes or the systems to do this, and if you're not adapting to this change fast enough, you're not going to last. Yeah.
This idea of supply surplus is a really important thing in terms of seeing some of the mistakes that happen in this space where, right, it feels like there's a lot of, well, we need to focus on skills and training and all of this stuff that's oriented towards supply. But then what are you training them for? What are the skills for if there's no jobs to connect them to? So I think one big lesson for me is all of this stuff happening on the supply side is not really relevant if the demand isn't there, right? I remember Brian Hilda, who's the CEO of the African talent company, telling me once that there's this surplus of accountants, I think, right? Like professional services, and you guys have a very hard time finding preschool teachers or something, right? So it is just a coordination problem to some extent. If we see that there is demand in certain areas, then we can train for the availability that's there, but what tends to happen instead is we focus on the supply, and that might be the issue with the artisan platforms as well. As these people are plumbers. I don't know if there's a surplus of plumbers, but we're just focusing on, well, how can we get these people jobs, and not focusing on the demand side of the equation.
Yeah, I want to add to that actually. You're absolutely right. And what happens with a lot of interventions now, we've got quite a number of donors and different people who are trying to address this supply issue. But how are they going about it, right? Are we sitting in a boardroom and imagining everybody doesn't have soft skills and then you're pushing out hundreds of thousands of people with soft skills? But have you actually done like the demand stimulation to understand where the actual jobs, what's the actual skill that's needed for you to be able to design these interventions based on that? That's not the case right now, right?
I want to continue in this line of thinking, which is to say, what is specific about Jobtech in Africa, right? I think we've seen certain kinds of platforms be really successful in other regions, and it hasn't really worked to replicate them, but other instances in which they've replicated fairly well here. So what are the features of sort of Jobtech in Africa that we should be aware of in making these platforms work?
Well, I think it's the two most important things are supply surplus and low levels of formal jobs, right? So if you accept the reality that those two things are going to impact the supply and demand equation for any job tech platform, then you have to build according to those realities.
So Africa's been the leader in a lot of different things at Uber. So the first time Uber accepted cash was in Nigeria and in Kenya in 2016. Mobile money disbursements in the US and in Europe, drivers receive their earnings into their bank accounts. In East and West Africa, it's now into your mobile money account. So these are the sort of local requirements that are needed to be successful here that, a company that's coming from abroad may not necessarily see. And to echo what Justin said, it was a hugely frustrating process last year when we were doing our regular forecasts. And our regular forecasts are based on, well, if you have this many drivers and this many supply hours, this is how many trips you can do. And we were like, listen, toss that out, look at the demand side of the market, that's where we're limited, and let's build our forecasting based on that. So it's a whole different perspective. So you got to be agile as a global company and sort of adapt the best practices, but also incorporate what the local market needs.
All right, so we're hearing supply, we're hearing cash. Michelle, you want to add?
No, I think speaking to the demand piece is finding out and being agile quickly and being able to say clearly this is not working, let's try something else. We've seen people get stuck, if it worked in Europe, it can work here, it can work, right? We've talked about having, sometimes platforms need to think about both online and offline and in person. How do you actually also able to upskill people within platforms so that they're able to access it? And then I guess the other thing I was thinking about is things like insurance, all these things that actually enable people not to actually work. You need to have what in our terms called work enablement. How do you have them to be able to enable them to actually able to work? Access to laptops, for example, if you're thinking about digital jobs. So there's access to capital, access to actually infrastructure itself, and Wi-Fi.
So what I would add, I think I agree with most of what's been said, but what I would add is in terms of what I see helping job tech platforms in Africa really achieve scale is, in terms of what I see that helps job tech platforms in Africa achieve scale is really thinking about data, right? Thinking about data as an asset that helps you unlock new revenue streams, right? So I think that's not something, obviously there's a ton of stuff, from day one that's happening. You have to take your core supply and demand, but as you think about growing and scaling the platforms and unlocking new revenue streams, it's like data is, how you approach data is really pivotal. I think you just mentioned insurance, but if you think about the data asset, and I'll just use GoZem, a company I co-founded, right? So it started as a ride-hailing platform. So that's kind of the core of the business. The first few years of the business are centered around that. But then we really focused on that data and building that out in terms of how a driver's earning, who are performing drivers, and that allows you to now go to banks and unlock loans and lending, right? And then you focus a bit more on the platform. We rolled out new products like food delivery, and then you kind of see, talking to people, that there's actually a market for peer-to-peer transfers, right? Peer-to-peer, just sending money within the platform to avoid some costs of mobile money, et cetera. So, there's a core of what, a job tech platform, the core revenue stream of matching, but there's also ancillary revenue streams that could become very significant as you grow, and that is really unlocked by data. So it's really thinking about data as an asset.
I agree with everything everyone said. I think it's just re-echoing what we've been discussing all morning. I think for me it's separate the platform from the business, right? Scaling a business is one thing, and it covers everything we've mentioned, resources, adaptability, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of times founders get obsessed with the platform itself, and then building a business is a whole other story, right? So the moment you have that separation and you understand what your model is, or where you're finding your suppliers or your customers and where you need to grow and all these different things, and everything becomes a bit more clear. So the platform becomes a tool or the thing you're selling, but the actual operation around it is a completely different thing. So those two things need to be separated.
I want to hear from you about what you see to be the risks and threats on the horizon. Like, what is going to tank this if we don't get it right? Certainly, we're hearing something about need for capital, but getting these things set up is expensive. We're hearing something about data and connectivity. What else do we need to just really be aware of?
In my view, the bigger risk is not trying and experimenting and failing in feedback loops. I think that like a perpetuation of the status quo and half measures to trying to make a dent in this issue is actually a bigger risk than anything else we can discuss. I think we see the constraints, right? And sometimes, the half measure is, well, we're going to try and operate within these constraints, but what does the sort of wildest experiments in the job tech space look like? And why can't we do that? Because I actually think that could lead to better outcomes, or a failure of that is not as bad as, again, the status quo perpetuating. So
being insufficiently ambitious.
Yeah, not taking enough risk is a bigger risk
I
than taking too much risk.
Okay.
I actually really like that, because even as we always think about the Job Tech Alliance, we always say it's a 10-year initiative, it's not a 2-year initiative. It'll take time, but how do you actually plan for that? And I think that requires us to test out new models, test out new things, and not be afraid to fail and fail fast, and be able to actually continue to grow, because it's a whole sector. And I think as we continue to learn, is how we learn quickly so that we're able to develop more sustainable business models, so that the people who come after us, we are able to actually continue to grow the whole sector.
So I think it's a risk and an opportunity at the same time, and I think I mentioned it before. I actually think the larger business opportunity for job tech is significantly untapped. It's on the offline side. The issue is that it's going to require quite a bit of resources, and a lot of patient resources would be the way I would put it. I think a lot of us here invest and none of us are patient. So how we overcome that becomes an issue, because I think, as has been mentioned before, Emeka mentioned that what's happening is that you're earning in local currency and then you're reporting in USD, and that disparity is not funny, right? Nigeria's seen over 100% devaluation in 6 months. Ghana saw about the same in the year before. Kenya saw almost 30% last year. So you're consistently chasing this thing that's unachievable. And if you think about it from the team perspective, you can't change your sales team's target because the dollar has changed. It means that you're asking them to do a lot more and produce a lot more using the same resources, which is sort of impossible. So you keep rotating in this place, right? So I think longer term, committed, patient funds would be what I would think would be needed.
Sure. So I think from my perspective, the high cost of capital, the high cost of borrowing, I think 18% plus in Kenya, that makes any investment require extremely high hurdle rate before you even commit to it, which then goes into the lack of ambition, but also the chance of success is much lower. And then when you look at the devaluation as well, this is not necessarily what people want to hear, but the reality is the macroeconomic conditions are extremely tough. You have fuel price spikes, things like that. So I would say these external shocks are probably the limiting factors to the growth.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I would say that, I mean, the macro affects everyone, right? If you're tech, even business in general. I think within the tech sector, there's certain constraints, certain challenges all tech entrepreneurs have relative to infrastructure. People are still coming online. You know, people are still learning how to use some platforms, et cetera. So there are some challenges that are universal relative to tech, building tech platforms, tech solutions in Africa. Relative to job tech specifically, you know, I think, you know, I guess what I'd like to see is how I would rephrase the question. What I would like to see more of is kind of folks focused on niches, right, versus kind of the broad. I think the easy thing is, okay, let's build something broad like a job tech platform for artisans, right? So I think the opportunity that really exists that's kind of untapped in my eyes is kind of folks that focus on niches that have deep experience to kind of identify these niches, right? And that's something, you know, I think will come. I think it's, but I think today there's still, you know, it's still surface level kind of opportunity identification, right? So that's where I think, and if that continues, I suppose that's a key risk for the sector. Yeah.
My name is Anthony Muni. I'm set to launch a job tech platform in the next couple of weeks. We're targeting the mass market, especially workers who earn less than 50,000 Kenya shillings. My question is, really, when you look at the jobs platforms that have existed within the continent the past 2 decades, and you look at the number of jobs that are created in a bunch of countries, like Kenya, it's said around 800,000 jobs are created every year. If you compare the number of jobs created and the number of jobs that you can access through your phone, online, you see a really, really small proportion of these jobs actually being findable on the platforms that exist. And I just wanted to ask the panelists if you have any insight on that. What kind of challenges have you seen, especially somebody like Brian, I know he's in the space. What kind of challenges have you seen, you know, just standing in the way of an everyday job like, you know, a butcher or a salonist or a driver or a cleaner, landing online and being accessible to a population which now we understand is more, you know, internet ready, more, let's say, capable of being able to access the web.
Hi, my name is Ibi from Fitted. Fitted is a job tech platform for tailoring. We make pretty awesome clothes like what I'm wearing now. And we manage like a bunch of tailors to basically connect and produce clothing all over the place. My question is really around the capitalization, which is a problem. Just for everybody, I have a private equity background, which is what I did before this, and venture capital, so I got a bit of understanding there. But with the capitalization problem, it seems like there's a mismatch between who's funding job tech and who should be funding job tech. So in the realm of the fact that you need more resources than you think you need, how do you figure that we solve the problem sustainably when the people who should benefit from it most aren't funding it? And you tend to have this vision problem where it's a bit of a chicken and egg, like you said, whereby the benefactors of like successful job tech is governments, it's the private capital networks, and it's basically the whole of the economy. But if you look at who's been on this screen for who's funding and who's actually backing this, it's completely separate. So where you need a large check to actually get success, but you have this chicken and egg, are there any like key insights or recommendations for how that can be fixed sustainably? Because I think without that being fixed, it gets really challenging to actually move the needle. Yeah.
Funding continuum.
Hi, Juliet Keeley here from the African Leadership Group. So my question is really around the quality of jobs being created through these job tech platforms. So if we take Uber as an example, you know, these are really atomized jobs where people can't, you know, join Uber as a company. So just wondering, you know, what is the quality of jobs being created through these platforms? Are these jobs that help people sustainably get out of poverty? And how do you feel that job tech platforms are addressing this problem?
Okay, great. So I'm going to distribute these. Brian, can you maybe talk to us about the challenges of like sort of findability and matching online? And then I will ask maybe Justin and Michelle to tackle this question about quality of jobs, and Emeka and Imran to address the question about capital, right stage fit capital. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
So I think fundamentally the question was what's stopping all jobs from being online, right? And I think I've touched on it severally as I've been speaking. For blue-collar jobs, which would be your artisanal butchers, barbers, and the likes, I think fundamentally the issue is that in Africa we do not view those jobs as professions, right? Because in the US or in the UK, a plumber gets a lot of money per hour to deliver that service, right? Because that service is viewed as a profession that's taken seriously, right? That could go down all the way until a waiter, which is not the case in Africa. That's the first issue. The second issue in terms of not using, but what happens is that there's lots of jobs like you've mentioned, rightfully, that are out there that are not on these platforms. But think about how a normal SME hires. They will not use a platform. They'll either use a referral, they'll speak to their, I don't know, WhatsApp group, network, whatever it is, right? And they'll do this whole transaction offline. Getting them to change that mindset is, again, what I mentioned earlier. It's going to take like a lot of education and stuff for them to know that this is a better way, it's more efficient, you can hold them more accountable, blah, 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 right? The third thing, and you mentioned something to do with the internet and usability. Yes, the internet is out there, but what's it being used for? It's being used for communication, fundamentally, at least in Africa. We've not gotten to the level where the usability of that internet has gone up to using services. It's coming up with players like Uber and the likes, but for the job market in particular, it's a bit more touchy. We're not there yet. The last point I'll raise is that government is the largest employer in sub-Saharan Africa, hands down. Are they going to put those jobs on the internet? What are the processes that they're using in there to hire? How are you going to eliminate things like nepotism, tribal, all these other things, right? How exactly are you going to do that? Because, of course, the primary customer of what we're doing should be the government, but is the government ready for that change? Do they want that level of transparency through their processes? Yeah, thanks.
Quality of jobs. I mean, I think you started to get at this with sort of portfolio, but yeah.
Yeah, I think we kind of agree on that of quality of jobs. We look at what we've seen in the gig economy, it's portfolio of work. You probably will not have one person doing one thing and be able actually to get maybe sustainable income. But there's a wide range of things we're seeing with our job tech platforms. Some of them is like, if you see it as a gig work, you are thinking about its flexibility and all other things, or how you're viewing it. So when we were interviewing some of the platform members, they're like, we see these as, it's not going to be a full-time job, it's going to be like a side hustle to actually create more. So if you have, like for example, I see Rosie, like working for Rosie, working for Tendo. Tendo is a social commerce platform. So when you stack those things up together, it becomes easier. So when you think about, for example, somebody like an Uber driver, during their downtime, they're able maybe to do something on their phone and earn extra income. That kind of creates what we call kind of like portfolio of work. But great question in terms of like quality of jobs. As Jobtech Alliance, we could easily count all these jobs, but what we said that we wanted to put ourselves kind of at a higher level and making sure we're actually creating quality of jobs. As we start working with a company, we kind of define what is the quality of job, what's the minimum that we can be able to count as a job. So that's like every platform we work with, we have a definition so that we're able to track that over time. But also, I guess, similarly, as the Jobtech Alliance, we've been able to kind of create like a quality of work toolkit, questionnaire that we developed like with ILO to be able to say, please, platforms, you can measure if you're actually having quality jobs and be able to actually come back and say, yes, I'm able to offer quality jobs as a part of the platform. So we are actually trying to offer those as tools.
Yeah. And I think where the problem arises is when we conflate a piece of the pie, a piece of the portfolio of work as a job, right? And so I think in the context, in the global context especially, where work is becoming unbundled from employment, right? So like for me, I mean, this is a bit of a misrepresentation, but I haven't had a formal job since 2016, right? I don't necessarily get all of the benefits either. I have to go out to the market and get them, right? And so if we, again, accept the reality of what the portfolio of work looks like and build benefits and other things so that things can become more dignified, right? As opposed to saying, well, why isn't Uber giving health insurance to its drivers, right? How much of the, the revenue of an Uber driver is coming strictly from Uber versus all of the other things that they're doing? And then the only other thing that I'll say is, and I don't know if this is going to be controversial or not, but in the context of development and job creation, in the context of such constrained demand, I often ask, what is the alternative, right? And so if we feel that a platform is creating undignified work, what does the user think, and what would the alternative be for them as opposed to the income that they're generating on that platform?
And I'll just add very quickly, a challenge basically to folks building job tech platforms, right, to think about this very question. You know, how do I build into my model a way for folks to effectively graduate to different earning opportunities? And the example in ride hailing and Uber, GoZim, et cetera, is that today I could start out as a ride hailing driver. Tomorrow I could be a vehicle owner that has a ride hailing driver driving for me. Then I could have a fleet of 10 cars and so forth. So there's an acceleration as I become more mature on the platform. So that's something, for folks building job tech platforms today. How could I build a model where folks that join me at the supply side kind of graduate and earn more within the platform?
So I'll also add on to that because I think everybody's mentioned Uber. So, for example, what we see is there's two entry points. There's a driver that has their own car or a driver that doesn't have their own car but wants to drive on Uber. If we just look at this entry point, what we see over time and tenure on the platform in terms of number of trips is a driver could start off just renting a car per day, getting a feel for the industry. After a few months, they then may commit to a lease-to-own model. So for 2-3 years, somebody's imported a car, they're paying daily or weekly for that car, but at the end of that 2-3 years, they now own that vehicle. So they now have a significant asset that can help them generate wealth. And a lot of our most tenured drivers on the platform will be vehicle owners themselves. So we can definitely see that trend over time. And then, as Emeka said, many of them come to the end of their repayment, they now own the vehicle, and they will place that vehicle with somebody else and say, now look, you pay me every day for this vehicle, I'm going to go get another loan for a second vehicle, and then compound that forward. And we have hundreds of drivers that on the platform that have more than one vehicle and using a fleet system are then able to become entrepreneurs in this space.
Thank you very much to our panelists.